All right, so today we're diving into some footage from September 11th, 2001, and kind of trying to see how it gives us a new way to think about that day. We've got a bunch of articles here, all about a guy named Kei Sugimoto. He decided to finally release this footage he took from his rooftop in New York City, and it's really interesting to see how people are talking about it online. Like Sugimoto's own thoughts on it, but also people who are seeing this perspective, like, for the first time.
Yeah, it really shows how much power a personal story has, especially so many years later, to help us understand things in a way that, official reports and stuff never could.
Totally. It's almost hard to believe, but Sugimoto, he started that morning totally normal. It was just a regular Tuesday, no idea what was about to happen. He saw smoke coming from the North Tower, but figured it was a fire.
And that's what led him to do something we've probably all done at some point. He went up to his roof to get a better look, just out of curiosity.
Right, which just goes to show how unexpected the whole thing was. But then, while he's up there, more and more people start coming up to the roof, too. And the whole mood changes. People are hearing these crazy rumors about attacks on other buildings, like the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. You can practically feel the tension, like nobody knows what's going on.
And then there's that moment that changes everything. When Sugimoto sees the second plane hitting the South Tower, it immediately hits him that this is no accident. This was planned. It's just chilling.
Yeah, Sugimoto actually says in one of the articles that he ran back to his apartment to grab his video camera right then. Like, he just knew something historic was happening. And he went from just watching to wanting to document the whole thing, which is where the footage we're talking about comes from.
And his view, really captures how raw it was on the ground. All the people gathering, how there were no cars, which is so weird for New York City. You can just sense the disbelief, and the fear is powerful. It really brings you back to that day.
It's wild to think that he had this footage for 23 years. And didn't share it. I can't even imagine what it would be like to carry around those images and memories for so long.
Yeah, it makes you wonder. What other stuff is out there? Personal archives, with pieces of history we've never even seen.
Right. He says in the articles that it was a tough decision to share it. He hesitated at first.
Which is a really interesting point, isn't it? What's our responsibility when we have something like that? Especially now when information and, misinformation can spread so fast.
Totally. But in the end, he decided to upload it. He calls it preserving history. But he's also really honest about how, even after all this time, watching it again was shocking and a little traumatizing.
It really makes you think about how trauma works, how it can come back even decades later. And it adds a whole other layer to why he shared it. It's not just about history for him. It's also about dealing with his own past.
Yeah. He even mentions that watching the towers collapse was especially hard for him, because he thought everyone had gotten out by then, since so much time had passed since the first plane hit.
That just hits home, the human cost of it all,
Yeah.
How many people were lost and how the effects of that trauma went way beyond just those who were there.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give some context for anyone who maybe doesn't remember everything about that day, 9/11 involved 4 hijacked planes. They targeted the Twin Towers, obviously, but also the Pentagon. And the 4th one ended up crashing in a field in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and we know now that the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania was probably headed for either the White House or the Capitol building. Almost 3,000 people died in the attacks.
Yeah.
Thousands more were hurt. And these events, they led to the war on terror, which has had its own set of, devastating consequences around the world.
And Sugimoto even talks about how those consequences affected him personally. He mentioned some relatives of friends in Chinatown who ended up dying from complications related to breathing in asbestos.
Right, and that reminds us of the long-term health effects that came after the towers fell. That dust cloud had asbestos in it and lead and all sorts of other dangerous stuff, which caused a lot of people to have respiratory problems and cancer in the years that followed.
So Sugimoto puts his footage up on YouTube, hoping to add to the historical record. But then what happens next? How does the internet, with all its craziness, react to this new perspective on 9/11?
Well, the reactions were pretty mixed. A lot of people were really grateful that you shared it. They called it a unique perspective and talked about how clear the footage was and how it showed details that you couldn't see in the main footage that everyone's seen from the South and East.
Yeah, you can really sense a kind of awe in those comments. People realizing that one person's viewpoint can change how we understand history, even after 23 years. But there's another side to the online response that we need to talk about.
Yeah, unfortunately, even though Sugimoto tried to be really clear about why he was sharing the footage, Some people still came up with conspiracy theories in the comments.
It just goes to show, like, how misinformation and these theories are always going to be a problem, especially with something as emotionally charged as 9/11. But before we get into that, let's hear from some of the people who shared their own experiences from that day. In the YouTube comments, I mean.
It's crazy how, like, even after all these years, 9/11 still gets to people. Like, really powerful reactions.
Yeah, there was this one comment that really stuck with me. It was from a woman in the UK. She was saying how she remembered watching it all happen on TV with her little daughter. It just shows how much the whole world was watching, you know? Everyone felt that same shock and disbelief.
Oh, yeah. And then there was that other commenter who talked about not being able to look away from the TV that day. I think a lot of us can relate to that, It's like these comments, even though they're short, they give you these little glimpses into how people all over experienced 9/11. It reminds you that history isn't just facts and dates. It's like real people's stories,
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting how those personal experiences can get mixed up with what's happening today and change how people see the past. Like there was this one commenter who said that if Trump had been president back then, things might have gone differently.
Yeah, that's something we see a lot with these big historical events,
Yeah.
especially ones that people still feel so strongly about. It's like we're always trying to understand the past through what's happening right now,
Yeah,
and through our own political views.
totally. It definitely seems like those personal stories add a whole new dimension to how we see history. But I wonder, is there a risk of focusing too much on those individual stories? Could it lead to like a messed up view of history where it's all just personal experiences and we miss the bigger picture?
That's a good question. And it really gets at the heart of the problem we have with history these days, especially with social media. While personal stories can help us connect to the past and understand it better, it's important to also look at the bigger context, like what was happening in the world, what forces were at play, how everything was connected.
Yeah, so it's not about ignoring personal experiences, but more about seeing how they fit into the bigger picture. It reminds me of something we talked about earlier, Sugimoto's hesitation to share the footage. He was worried about conspiracy theorists twisting his story.
Oh, yeah, and that brings up a really important point. Like, what's our responsibility when we have a piece of history like that? Especially now, when it's so easy for misinformation to spread like wildfire.
Right, it's like a double-edged sword. On one hand, we have everyone sharing information, which means we get to hear from all sorts of people. But then there's the risk of that information being twisted or used for bad purposes.
Exactly. It's a tough balance, trying to preserve and share history while also being careful about how it might be misused.
So how do we strike that balance? How do we make sure personal stories and historical stuff help us understand the past better instead of just causing more division and spreading lies?
Well, it's complicated, but I think a big part of the solution is something called information literacy.
Information literacy. Can you explain what that is? I'm not sure I really get it.
Basically, it's about giving people the tools they need to figure out if information is reliable or not.
Okay.
Like how to tell if the source is credible, how to spot bias.
So like being a smarter consumer of information, especially online where it's hard to tell what's true and what's not, questioning things instead of just believing everything you see.
Exactly. It's
Yep.
about asking yourself, who made this? Why did they make it? What are their biases? Does this match up with what other sources are saying?
Yeah, that makes sense. It seems like that would be super useful these days with how much information we're constantly bombarded with, but how do we actually do that? Like, what are some specific things people can do to become more information literate?
Well, a good place to start is always looking at the source. Is it a well-known news organization? An academic journal? A government website? Or is it just some random blog or social media post with an agenda?
Right, so checking the source is key. But what about the information itself? Are there any red flags that might tell us it's biased or fake?
Oh, definitely. If something seems like it's trying to be super sensational or get a big reaction out of you, it's good to take a step back and think about why that might be. Also, be careful of explanations that are too simple, or arguments that make it seem like there are only two sides to a complicated issue. History is rarely that black and white.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's also important to look for other sources that say the same thing, right? Like if something sounds too good to be true or just fishy, you should check if other reliable sources are reporting it too.
Exactly. And if you're not sure about something you see online, don't be afraid to check websites that specialize in fact-checking or organizations that fight misinformation.
Good advice. And I guess it's important to remember that people don't always spread misinformation on purpose, right? Sometimes it's just because they're careless or haven't done their research.
That's true. It's important to be skeptical of what you see online, but also to keep an open mind and consider different points of view.
It sounds like becoming information literate is something you have to work on constantly, like a way of thinking.
It is. And it goes hand in hand with developing critical thinking skills and being aware of your own biases and how they might affect how you see things.
Because at the end of the day, how we take in and understand information shapes how we see the world. It affects what we believe and even what we do. And this is especially true when it comes to history.
Yeah, absolutely. How we interpret and remember the past has a huge impact on how we live now, or what we think about the future.
So coming back to Sugimoto and his footage, it seems like his story has started a conversation that's bigger than just 9/11. It's a conversation about memory and responsibility and the challenges of preserving history in the digital age.
Exactly. And it highlights how important information literacy and critical thinking are to make sure history helps us understand things better, instead of just being used to spread misinformation and manipulate people.
It also makes us think about the role social media plays in shaping our collective memory. We've talked about how individual comments can give us insights, but also how algorithms and the nature of online platforms can spread misinformation and twist history.
Right, that's something we definitely need to dig into more. Like, how are platforms like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter affecting how we understand events like 9/11? Especially for people who weren't alive back then.
Yeah, that's a great question. After all, if we want to make a better future, we need to understand the past. So we've been talking about how much power personal stories have in shaping how we understand history and how social media plays a role in all that. It seems especially relevant when we think about 9/11. I mean, that's an event that's been documented and discussed online like a ton.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how social media has turned everyone into like mini historians. People forming their opinions about 9/11 based on little bits and pieces they see online, often without the full context.
Right. It's like we're all creating this collective memory of 9/11,
Yeah.
but it's being built from all these random online interactions.
Exactly. And the problem is that algorithms, which control so much of what we see online, they care more about getting people to click and engage than they do about accuracy. So stuff that's sensationalized or misleading or just plain wrong, that can easily spread and influence how people see historical events.
It's like a big game of telephone, where the original message gets distorted every time it's shared.
Right, and those distortions can have real consequences.
Yeah.
They can make people more divided, reinforce their biases, and even make them distrust experts and institutions.
We even saw some of that in the comments on Sugimoto's footage. People dismissing the official story, clinging to conspiracy theories, coming up with alternative explanations for how the towers collapsed.
It just shows how social media can be used to manipulate people, especially when it comes to something as emotional as 9/11. People are looking for answers, trying to make sense of tragedy. And platforms like YouTube can easily become echo chambers, where people just hear what they already believe or get fed misinformation.
So how do we fix this? How do we stop social media from turning history into a battleground where nobody can agree on what happened?
Well, it's tough. There's no easy answer. But I think media literacy is a good place to start. We need to teach people, especially young people, how to think critically about what they see online, how to spot bias, how to look for different perspectives.
So it's about giving people the tools they need to understand history for themselves, not just accepting whatever they see on their feeds.
Exactly. It's also about making sure platforms like YouTube are doing their part, promoting reliable sources, fighting misinformation.
Because in the end, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding where we are now and making a better future.
Right. If we let social media distort our understanding of the past, it's going to mess up our vision for the future, too.
It's almost like we need some kind of digital 9/11 commission, but one that's focused on protecting historical truth online.
That's an interesting idea. What if there was a platform where experts and regular people can work together to debunk misinformation, provide context, and present a more accurate picture of history?
It would be a huge undertaking, but it might be necessary in the age of social media.
It would definitely take a lot of work from individuals, platforms, and institutions.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive for today. We started by looking at Kei Sugimoto's 9/11 footage, and we ended up talking about the power of personal stories, the challenges of finding truth in history, and how social media is changing how we remember the past.
And it leaves us with something to think about. How can we, as individuals and as a society, make sure that the digital age helps us understand history better instead of making things worse?
That's definitely something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.